A young fellow, depleted and ridiculous, appears on an ocean side, gazing upward immediately to see two small kids playing in the sand before he drops. An outfitted watchman finds him and has him brought to an enormous, shoreline royal residence where the owner, an old Japanese man, is recounted the more bizarre appearance. The main items found on him were a handgun and a metal top. The elderly person permits the outsider to enter. He is hauled in and given some food which he battles to gobble as the elderly person gets the metal top and says, "You help me to remember someone, a man I met in a half-recalled dream." He was equipped with a few revolutionary ideas. The Morad looks into an acknowledgement as the scene shifts. Dom Cobb and his accomplice, Arthur, address a planned client, Saito, in a shockingly comparable lounge area about the administrations they give, explicitly security against hoodlums worked in removing significant data from a subject while they're dreaming. Cobb makes sense of that. When one is sleeping, one's psyche is helpless against assault, and what he can do is train Sato's brain to subliminally guard against extractors to safeguard anything privileged insights he might stow away. He backs up his case by uncovering that he is the most talented extractor there is and realizes every one of the stunts in question. Seeming wary, Saito stands to leave, telling Cobb he will think about his suggestion, and weighs out the space to join a little party in the principal lobby. Arthur projects Cobb a look, saying, he knows as the room shakes. They stroll to an external overhang where other party participants blend, and Arthur focuses to a lady close by, asking Cobb what she's doing here. Cobb guarantees him that he'll deal with it and to continue with the gig. He knows where Sato's privileged insights are. He looked over at a safe the moment Cobb referenced the word. Cobb approaches the one who inquires as to whether he misses her. He answers that he really does yet can't confide in her any longer. They retreat to a confidential room where Cobb attaches a rope to the leg of a seat and removes the end from the window. He tells the lady, Mal, to sit down as she inquires as to whether the kids miss her. Cobb stops a second prior to saying, I can't envision. He then, at that point, repulses through the window to an edge underneath, almost falling when Mal leaves her seat. He breaks into the room underneath and gets to the safe, trading out the manila envelope inside for another, as the lights in the room turn on. He turns with his weapon out to see Mal pointing a firearm at him and remaining close to Saito and a watchman holding Arthur. Cobb inquires as to whether she told him as he slides his weapon across the table. Saito answers that you are here to take from me, or that we are sleeping. This validates. Them three are connected to a passive gadget which takes care of them, the rest drug somnacin, keeping them generally sleeping and permitting dream sharing. They are looked after by Nash, one more of Cobb's accomplices. He really takes a look at Saito, resting on a bed, prior to going into one more space to mind Arthur and Cobb, both sleeping in seats. Cobb's seat sits over a tub brimming with water. Blasts and yells outside draw nearer as a horde of agitators drops down the road. Inside the fantasy, Mal holds her weapon to Arthur's head, however Cobb tells her the danger is vacant, as he hands the manila envelope over to Saito, since shooting him will just awaken him. Mal grins in arrangement, however says that aggravation is just in the psyche and seen as genuine as she shoots Arthur in the knee, making him shout out. Cobb plunges across the table and recovers his firearm prior to firing Arthur in the head. He then runs out of the room under gunfire from Sato's gatekeepers. Arthur awakens and teaches Nash that things are going to pieces, yet Cobb has opportunity and energy to follow through with the task before he keeps an eye on the as yet resting Saito. Saito wildly opens the manila envelope as the fantasy falls and yells out of resentment as he tracks down clear pages inside. Cobb figures out how to stow away briefly to take a gander at the items in the genuine organizer which he'd concealed in his coat, looking over the secret documents as the structure disintegrates around him. Saito is squashed by trash and awakens in the condo, concealed to Arthur as he arrives at under his pad. Arthur advises Nash to wake Cobb by giving him the kick. Nash pushes Cobb in reverse into the tub and, as he raises a ruckus around town, Cobb's fantasy is overwhelmed with gigantic waves flowing through the windows before he awakens. Saito, having arrived at under his pad for his firearm, snatches Arthur yet is stifled by Cobb, who lets him know that not all the data he really wanted was in the record he took. Saito snickers and claims that all the data he had was in the record since he knew about Cobb's trick from the beginning. He permitted Cobb and Arthur into his brain as a component of a tryout which they fizzled, saying that, "Your trickiness was self-evident." Affirming that his manager, Cobalt Designing, will not acknowledge disappointment, Cobb tosses Saito on the floor and requests that he let them know what they need to realize about his extension project. With his face squeezed into the floor covering, Saito starts to chuckle once more and uncovers that he knows about the material of the rug. It should be made of fleece rather than polyester. In this way, he reaches the resolution that he is as yet dozing. Sufficiently sure, Saito, Arthur, Nash, and Cobb are snoozing in the vehicle of a train, watched over by a young fellow named Tadashi who screens the time staying on the passive gadget. He puts earphones over Nash's ears and plays music as a signal that there's no time to spare. The music plays faintly inside the fantasy, yet sufficient that Nash can hear it. As the revolting horde outside moves closer, Saito compliments Cobb on making a fantasy inside a fantasy, yet ends up being confounded at his failure to control this fantasy. Nash uncovers that they're not in that frame of mind in his. The horde gets through the entryway, going after everybody in the room, and Arthur, Nash, and Cobb awaken on the train. Cobb scolds Nash, the modeler of the fantasy, for planning the rug wrong and tosses Tadashi a chunk of change prior to leaving, telling them, survival of the fittest. Saito gets up minutes after the fact to find himself alone in the vehicle, save for Tadashi, who's continued an easygoing posture, however grins wryly to himself. In his loft, Cobb turns his metal top and takes his firearm, pointing it at his sanctuary as the top twists. At the point when it falls, he inhales a murmur of help and puts the weapon down. His telephone rings and he gets it to hear his two youngsters, James and Philippa, on the other line with their grandma. They ask while he's returning home and he answers that he can't due to work. At the point when James inquires as to whether their mom is with him, a picture of Mal enters his thoughts. Cobb stops and lets him know that Mama's not here any longer. He advises them to act and that he'll send Giv's granddad before their grandma hangs up. Arthur thumps on the entryway and tells Cobb their ride is on the rooftop. Cobb chooses to travel to Buenos Aires to keep out of sight in lieu of their bombed work for Cobalt, while Arthur says he's returning stateside. Cobb requests that he send his views as they make the way for the helicopter and see Nash, beaten and wounded, and Saito sitting tight for them. Clearly, Nash had attempted to sell out Cobb and Arthur for his own well-being, yet Saito has different interests. He extends to Cobb an employment opportunity performing Origin for him, something Arthur claims is inconceivable. Cobb, nonetheless, says that it's certainly feasible yet very troublesome since it includes causing someone to think about a thought as opposed to separating one. He dismisses, demanding that he'll figure out how to determine relations with Cobalt himself, yet Saito then inquires as to whether he needs to return home to his kids in America. He guarantees Cobb that, in the event that he succeeds, he should simply settle on a telephone decision and the charges keeping Cobb out of the nation will be dropped. Frantic, and to Arthur's irritation, Cobb acknowledges. They board the helicopter with Saito while two hooligans divert Nash to a questionable destiny. On the way, Arthur clarifies for Saito the idea of commencement, letting him know that basically inspiring someone to think about a thought doesn't ensure that the thought will take. The subject might just find that the thought isn't theirs and reject it. Genuine motivation, Arthur claims, is incomprehensible, notwithstanding Cobb's contemplations in any case. Saito imparts to them his thinking for the gig. He really wants the president of a contending energy combination to separate his dad's organization, guaranteeing Sato's own Proclus worldwide complete control over the energy creation industry. Notwithstanding the overwhelming assignment, Cobb consents to play out the gig. Saito drops them off at the air terminal and encourages Cobb to carefully pick his group. Cobb goes to Paris where he gets together with his father by marriage, Miles, a teacher at a college and the person who showed Cobb and Mal dream sharing and planning dreams. Cobb requests a designer, one on par with he, and Miles directs him towards somebody better. He acquaints Cobb with an alumni understudy of his, Ariadne, who is promptly scrutinized by Cobb to plan a labyrinth that requires 1 moment to make and 2 to settle. Subsequent to dazzling Cobb with her abilities, he educates her additional regarding his profession and what is expected of her. Her occupation as draftsman will be to configuration dreams and make virtual labyrinths for the visionary subliminal to occupy while permitting Cobb and his group to work. As they talk outside a bistro, Cobb endeavors to make Ariadne mindful that they are in a fantasy. The acknowledgement makes Ariadne alarm and the fantasy savagely implodes. At the point when they conscious, Ariadne finds they are in Cobb's stockroom studio where Arthur is checking them. Ariadne shows shock when Arthur says they've been under just 5 minutes when it seemed like hours. Cobb makes sense of that the brain works quicker in a fantasy, so time moves more slow. Once more, they go under and Ariadne is offered the chance to modify the physical science of the fantasy innovatively. Her engineering ponders cause individuals in the fantasy, projections of Cobb's psyche, to look for the gatecrasher, Ariadne, like white platelets attracted to an infection. At the point when Ariadne wrongly creates a scaffold from her recollections, Cobb remembers it and his inner mind responds as a crowd, isolating Ariadne from Cobb until Mal shows up and cuts her. She awakens and Cobb races to the bathroom while Arthur makes sense of that Cobb's inner mind became mindful of her as an intrusive being and she couldn't awaken immediately on the grounds that there was still time at work. The main way for her to awaken was if she kicked the bucket. Cobb takes out his top and twists it, moaning as it overturns. Ariadne leaves the distribution center, furious and declining to open her brain to Cobb on the off chance that his inner mind is pretty much as tortured as it appears. Cobb gets back to the room and guarantees Arthur that she'll be back, however he wants to make an excursion to Mombasa to enlist a close buddy to the group. He finds Eames betting at a bar and offers him a put in his group as an imitator. Eames concurs prior to telling Cobb he's being followed, highlighting 2 men at the bar. Cobb remembers them as COBOL hooligans who should intend to gather the abundance on his head for the messed up Saito work. Eames makes an interruption while Cobb evades, driving the hooligans on a tumultuous pursuit through the city roads. Without a second to spare, Saito pulls up in a limousine and gets first Cobb, then, at that point, Eames. He makes sense of that he's been following Cobb for safeguard his venture. Eames takes them to a neighborhood scientist he realizes who tries different things with Somnacin and who may be a resource for their group. Yusuf tunes in as Cobb makes sense of that his occupation might require the utilization of a 3-layered dream. Yusuf says that this would be generally unthinkable, because of the shakiness of dreams the further down you go, notwithstanding a unique arrangement he's composed with a strong narcotic. To show its adequacy, Yusuf takes them first floor where they see many men resting under the watch of an elderly person. He lets Cobb know that these men come here to awaken, dreaming has turned into their world. With the guide of the narcotic, their rest is profound and stable and they can dream for what feels to them like years. Cobb attempts the calming himself and is intrigued with its effects, however shaken subsequent to waking from a striking dream with Mal. He persuades Yusuf to join his group. In the meantime, Ariadne gets back to the studio where she lets Arthur know that she intended to remain away yet couldn't avoid the unadulterated creation associated with structural dreaming. Arthur brings her into a fantasy and presents the idea of making oddities, for example, the Penrose steps. He likewise uncovers that Mal was Cobb's significant other and has since died. Notwithstanding Mal's vindictive nature inside the fantasies, her reality now just as a projection of Cobb's, Arthur tells Ariadne she was exquisite, in actuality. The group groups together and concludes that they will make a 3-level dream with the 3rd level containing the established thought. The objective at the top of the priority list is Robert Fisher, the president and successor to Fisher Morrow, whose dad, Maurice, is gradually rotting with ailment. Eames focuses on Robert's guardian and colleague, Peter caramelizing, to get a superior handle on the dad-child dynamic and to utilize his impersonation abilities at their best. That's what the group concludes, to get Robert to separate his dad's organization, and in view of their confounded relationship, a positive thought will best a negative one. My dad believes me should be my own man. Saito regulates the greater part of the plans and, on the grounds that he needs full check of any achievement or disappointment, concludes that he will go with the group into the fantasies as a traveler. As the group plans over the course of the following couple of weeks, Arthur shows Ariadne the meaning of emblems, little, individual items that empower an individual to separate among dreams and reality. Cobb's symbol is his top, which overturns in reality and continues to turn in a fantasy. Arthur's is a stacked pass-on, and he teaches Ariadne to make one for herself that no one but she can contact to guarantee its legitimacy. She makes a semi-emptied miniature chess piece as her symbol. Needing however much time as could be expected to finish the task, the group chooses, with Sato's assistance, that they will play out the gig on a Boeing 747 during a global departure from Europe to Los Angeles, a 10-hour flight. This will allow them 7 days in the main phase of the fantasies. Saito uncovers that he's purchased the whole aircraft, making the occupation neater and without purchasing out specific areas of the plane for access. One night, following a day of concocting game plans, Ariadne finds Cobb dreaming alone in the studio. Inquisitive, she connects herself to his machine and ends up plummeting in a lift. She sees Cobb sitting in a lounge with Mal, who rapidly distinguishes Ariadne's presence. Cobb gets up and joins Ariadne in the lift, driving her through a portion of the levels that Ariadne finds are every particular recollections, something he initially told her never to do. Shocked subsequent to seeing Cobb's torture over venturing out from home without expressing goodbye to his youngsters, Ariadne takes the lift alone to the last level, where she sees a lodging, the items in which are flung on the floor. She steps on some split glass and Mal turns upward from the love seat, asking what she's doing here. Ariadne attempts to make sense of that. She simply needs to see. However, Mal becomes protective and gets a shard of glass. Cobb shows up and returns Ariadne to the lift as Mal surges forward, yelling at Cobb that he didn't stay true to his commitment. Ariadne and Cobb leave the fantasy, and Cobb makes sense of that. The explanation he can't return home is a result of Mal's demise, since it was believed that he killed her. He says thanks to Ariadne when she doesn't inquire as to whether he did or not. However, she cautions him that he's mixed up, assuming he wants to confine Mal like that. He really wants to deliver his culpability over her demise. Ariadne persuades Cobb to permit her to go with the group into the fantasies, since he really wants somebody who comprehends what he's going through. At that point, Saito and Arthur show up and declare that Maurice Fisher has kicked the bucket and Robert will be going with the body to the States in a couple of days. The group loads onto the flight and sits with Robert in a divided top-notch lodge. Cobb returns Robert's identification, pick stashed by Arthur, as an icebreaker, and afterwards sedates his water prior to giving an impromptu speech in his dad's honor. Inside minutes, Robert is snoozing, and the took care of airline steward helps setting up and enacting the passive gadget. All together, the group plunges into, first, Yusuf's fantasy. It is coming down vigorously in New York City as individuals from the group are gotten. Arthur and Saito secure a taxi, get Robert and Eames, and afterward Yusuf, as Saito holds a weapon to Robert as a feature of the grab trick. Cobb and Ariadne continue in a different vehicle until a train unexpectedly barges down the center of the road, hitting their vehicle and briefly slowing down them. Gunfire then opens in the taxi, and the group is compelled to take quick equivocal moves, hanging out in a distribution center where it's found that Saito has been shot in the chest. Robert is taken into one more space while Saito is laid on a table. Before Eames can shoot him to end his hopelessness and wake him up, Cobb stops him and makes sense of that. Because of the narcotics they've taken, they won't awaken, assuming they kicked the bucket. All things considered, they'll be shipped off Limbo. a common dream condition of crude subliminal where time is essentially non-existent. The group is maddened by this, asking why they've faced such a challenge, as they examine some solution for the military shutting down in on their area. They figure out that Robert's inner mind has been prepared to battle against extraction, and the projections going after them are important for that guard. With Sato's condition falling apart and unfit to stand by significantly longer because of the oncoming guard projections, the group concludes they need to finish the task as fast as could really be expected. Ariadne defies Cobb about the control he has over his own inner mind, and he admits that he can't keep Mal as far away from him as possible. He tells her that they had been exploring different avenues regarding dream states and needed to find out how far down they could turn out into their inner mind. They ended up in an in-between state together, unfit to leave on account of the time staying on their passive clock. They reproduced their lives, going through years' worth of building. After so lengthy, they started to see limbo as their existence. After something like 50 years, Cobb and Mal committed suicide on train tracks to take them back to the real world. Regardless of getting back to this present reality, Mal kept on accepting that she was all the while dreaming and accepted that withering was the best way to awaken. However, she wouldn't leave without Cobb. She adored him to an extreme. On their wedding commemoration, Cobb went to the lodging they generally remained in to find it destroyed and the window open. Outside, on a contrary edge, sat Mal, who uncovered to Cobb that she recorded a letter to their lawyer communicating a trepidation for her life, successfully outlining him in case of her demise and constraining him no alternate way than to join her. Cobb will not bounce and endeavors to carry Mal to her detects, however she overlooks him and leaps to her demise. Since she pronounced herself lawfully normal by 3 specialists, Cobb's case for his honesty is overruled by the extraordinary proof against him. With no other decision, Cobb abandons his youngsters with their grandma and escapes the country. Ariadne attempts to persuade Cobb that Mal's demise was not his shortcoming and that he really wants to zero in on the mission. Eames gets ready himself as a pantomime of caramelizing while Cobb and Arthur grill Robert, requesting to know the blend to his dad's protected. They pressure Robert by involving cooking as influence. Eames yells from one more space as though being beaten before he is carried into the room with Robert to attempt to inspire him to recollect. He lets Robert know that the safe contains a substitute adaptation of his dad's will, one that will break up the organization in the event that Robert decides so. Caramelizing lets Robert know that his dad cherished him and believed him should assemble something of his own. As Robert safeguards close in on the stockroom, Robert uncovers that single word he could translate out of his dad's final words was disheartened, persuading him that his dad didn't cherish him. Once more with the stockroom at risk for being invaded, the group pressure Robert for a blend. He lets them know a progression of irregular numbers that ring a bell before they load him into a van and medication him to rest. They all get in and get ready to enter the second level of the fantasy while Yusuf drives the van away from the chasing after projections. In Arthur's fantasy, Cobb makes plans to utilize Mr. Charles's, a strategy wherein he acquaints the subject with the way that he's dreaming to earn trust. He meets Robert at a bar and lets him know that he is there to safeguard him and somebody is attempting to get to his psyche. He persuades Robert that he's dreaming by presenting the abnormality of their environmental elements. Also, quiets Robert to control them. He assists Robert with recollecting that he's been captured and drives him to a lodging where the remainder of the group refocuses. Saito is in better well-being in this level of the fantasy, however before long starts hacking. At the point when Robert's projection on caramelizing shows up, Cobb persuades Robert that it was Searing who hijacked him by inquiring as to whether he saw Cooking being tormented by the ruffians in his past rest level. Caramelizing admits that he was liable for the grabbing, as the subsequent confirmation left to Robert permitted him to obliterate his dad's realm, which Searing couldn't allow him to make it happen. Cobb proposes to Robert that they enter Cooking's fantasies to sort out what was truly in the safe so Robert can choose for himself. Robert concurs, presently unwittingly aiding his own initiation, and the group is connected once more, this time with Arthur staying behind to watch over them and manage a synchronized kick when now is the ideal time. As the group goes into the third dream, in reality Arthur is compelled to ward off a greater amount of Robert's protective projections while in the main dream Yusuf keeps on driving the van. The third dream is set in snow-covered mountains where Robert's protected is vigorously watched in a mountainside post. The group separates to draw the gatekeepers away. Cobb goes with Ariadne, Eames travels solo to avoid the watchmen, and Robert and Saito start climbing a mountainside to get to a blind side of the stronghold. In the interim, Yusuf immediately fails to keep a grip on the van and it tumbles down a grade. The tumbling impact converts into Arthur's fantasy as he wards off Robert's projections, the climate around him turning as gravity switches and afterward freedoms itself. As Yusuf keeps driving, he becomes cornered on a raised scaffold with one vehicle loaded with projections stayed with him. Yusuf plays music through Arthur's earphones to caution him of the approaching dismiss prior to driving in reverse from the extension. Upon influence, the power sends Arthur in his fantasy flying and, as the van plunges in mid-air, there is a deficiency of gravity in Arthur's fantasy. The effect additionally converts into the third level of the fantasy. Saito and Robert look into the mountainside and are compelled to cut their lines as a torrential slide clears downward on them. Cobb acknowledges they've missed the primary kick, however they actually possess energy for the second one when the van raises a ruckus around town off the extension. Van drives off the extension, 10 seconds left to influence. Dream 2, 3 minutes to synchronize the kick. Arthur battles with a method for doing this without gravity. Dream 3, an hour left. With brief period left, Cobb requests to be aware on the off chance that there is one more way into the post and Ariadne yields into confessing to him of a mystery underground entry that Robert and Saito can get to. Cobb send them there, all while Saito's condition crumbles. They at last go into the fundamental room where the safe is situated while Cobb and Ariadne watch from a sharpshooter's point. Surrendering to his wounds, Saito is passed on to set down, hacking blood as Robert moves ahead. Be that as it may, as Robert comes into Cobb's view, so does someone else. Mal drops in from the roof and shoots Robert down before Cobb wakes up and shoots her. Eames is requested to the room as Cobb and Ariadne race to the site. Finding Robert dead, Cobb names the mission a disappointment, since the main other spot where Robert has gone is Limbo. Ariadne, in any case, persuades him that, assuming they go into Limbo, they'll have sufficient opportunity to track down Robert and bring him back. Eames consents to utilize a defibrillator to kick off Robert's heart to help while Cobb and Ariadne go under. In the meantime, in Dream Level 2, Arthur devises a novel arrangement. He utilizes telephone wires to integrate the group and carries them into the lift. He lines the beyond the vehicle with explosives, timing down till the kick fully intent on utilizing unstable power to make gravity and inducing a kick. In an in-between state, Cobb and Ariadne visit the disintegrating scene that he and Mal once assembled. They see old homes and structures before they find the one where Cobb knows Mal should be. Assuming they find Mal, they'll find Robert on the grounds that Mal will need to utilize something Cobb needs to carry him to her. Sufficiently sure, they enter the loft and Mal is sitting tight for them. Once more, she attempts to persuade Cobb that his place is with her in their genuine home with their youngsters. However, Cobb uncovers a horrendous truth, the justification for why Mal accepted that her fantasies were genuine. While they were in an in-between state, Mal had put away a reality that she would have rather not accepted any longer, her symbol, put inside her protected, lying on its side, stationary, telling her that her fantasy, her limbo, was reality. With an end goal to save her brain, Cobb broke into her safe and turned the top to persuade her that this world was not genuine. Nonetheless, he didn't have the foggiest idea about that, when they truly awakened, she would keep on trusting that. This was the manner by which he realized initiation would work, since he performed it on Mal first and his responsibility over her resulting demise has been tormenting him from that point forward. He tells Mal that he will remain with her in an in-between state, assuming she lets him know where Robert is, and she uncovers he's on the patio. Ariadne tracks down him there and pushes him off as an ad-libbed kick. Robert reawakens in Dream Level 3 with Eames' guide and opens his own protected, finding inside a picture of his bed-stricken dad mumbling his final word. Robert recognizes that his dad was disheartened that he was unable to be him, however Maurice says, "No. No. I was frustrated that you attempted." Maurice then, at that point, focuses to a bureau where Robert finds the will, and a paper fan his dad made for him once as a kid. Mournfully, Robert admires see his dad has passed and separates as the van raises a ruckus around town. Dream 2, Arthur raises a ruckus around town and the explosives force the lift down, making counterfeit gravity in the group. Dream 3, a progression of blasts set by Eames rock the stronghold, imploding the principal floor. In an in-between state, the synchronization of kicks pulls on Ariadne and she calls for Cobb to join her. Cobb says that he will remain in an in-between state, however not with Mal. At this point, Saito has kicked the bucket and joined Limbo also. Cobb should track down him however vows to return. Ariadne jumps off the side of the structure and rides the kicks back to Dream 1. In the van, Robert awakens and gets away from the lowered van with Sotaeing. Arthur and Ariadne share an oxygen tank with Yusuf before they get away from the van, leaving Cobb. Robert and Caramelizing come to shore where Robert uncovers that his dad truly believed him should be his own man and that he will do exactly that and sell his dad's organization. Realizing the mission is a triumph, Eames drops the cooking cover. In an in-between state, Cobb washes aground where the equipped gatekeeper tracks down him. He is brought to the Shoreline Royal Residence where the old Japanese man perceives his metal top. Cobb reviews what he could be done and calls to Saito, requesting that he return with him and honor their plan. The older Saito goes after Cobb's weapon. Cobb awakens in the aircraft and glances around, alarmed, to see Arthur and Ariadne snickering at him. He takes a gander at the now conscious Saito he recollects, gets the telephone and dials. The plane arrived in Los Angeles and Cobb apprehensively went through customs where security actually look at his identification, however invited him home and permitted him through. Cobb strolls past the remainder of the gathering and Robert, who stops briefly as though reviewing a half-recollected dream. In front of him, Cobb sees Miles shouting to him. They commute home together where Cobb falters prior to taking out his metal top. She turns it on the kitchen table when her children show up at the secondary passage. He surges over to them, eager to see their countenances again as the top twists, moves somewhat. What's more, the screen blurs to dark. This is where the story closes.